Introducing Frank Finkle, a soldier who claimed to have escaped the events in American history. Nevertheless, one man's narrative has long been shrouded in mystery among murder and avoided death. The Battle of Little Bighorn, where General George Custer died, is one of the most remembered tragedies and tales of bravery. In order to assist our community, please remember the 1920s. His story has been disputed and discussed for many years, but recent studies and data have liked and subscribed to our channel before we start. Many people, possibly 70 in number, claim to be the only survivors of the Battle of Little Bighorn between 1876 and the later provided fresh insight into this remarkable story. These gentlemen's stories of their alleged adventures, which usually fell into one of three categories: posing as Indians by hiding inside a hollowed-out horse or buffalo, wearing blankets, or being saved by a chief's daughter who believed they were being persecuted, captivated journalists and historians. However, the veracity of one person's story stood out. Even after Frank Finkle gave information that only a genuine participant could have known, historians continue to debate whether or not his claim is true. Frank Finkle rose to fame in his later years and after his death. He was reportedly the only person to survive General George Armstrong Custer's tragic final stand at the Battle of Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876. His account of the events, however, is tainted by contradictions. In January 1854, the census taker recorded the family's farm, valued at $500 in the 1860 U.S. Census, as Finkle. 6 sons and 1 girl were born to Peter, a German immigrant, and Magdalena Finkle, who was born in Washington County, growing up speaking German at home and attending public schools. Despite living in Ohio, Frank Finkle became bilingual and a proficient reader of English, despite the time and place. Some of the older men, like Frank, left the farm, which was too small to support 6 men, after being admitted to financial failure. Many young men registered using false identities, but Frank, like many native-born Americans, joined the American Army in January 1872, struggling in Chicago. He did what many young men do when they are too young. Peter Finkle left in 1868 to look for work elsewhere. When Frank Finkle went one step further, he chose a name that would help him advance in his career. Prussia had defeated Louis Napoleon and the young Republic of France the year before, so Prussian soldiers were in high demand. Frank Finkle took advantage of this by increasing his age from 18 to 27, while maintaining his birth date on January 23rd. He Germanized his name to August Finkle and included Clercashi's occupation. He told the Sodier of the Fifth Hand about his experiences as an officer in the Prussian army, which enabled him to rise swiftly to the rank of sergeant in just 2 years. By 1876, Finn was a second remarkable height, taller than 6 feet, with dark hair, gray eyes, and fluency in the language of the 7th Cavalry, including his German-born comrade, Charis Windhoff. Known for its high morale, this troop was composed of loyalists who reflected the divergent views of the 7th Cavalry officers. The company was one off of merchant after being assigned Big Floppy Andrews, who gave them a buccaneer-like companion who pooled their funds to buy more stylish headwear from a Chicago appearance. This decision caused controversy because the designated post trader chastised George Custer for shopping off-post. Investors, who were not often present at Army post, hired traders to deal with soldiers who were using rifles from 1866 to 1866, which are now considered surplus due to the Winston to whiskey. On the other hand, the Indians could rely on a steady supply of shot Henry and local Indians under the corrupt monopoly known as the post-trader system, in exchange for manning frontier posts, had to pay out outrageous sums for food that ranged from canned peaches to a 50% fee. The government's strategy, however, ensured that the Indians chose the Black Hills in 1875, which resulted in a Powder Keg-Off corruption, as many young people who were armed with single-shot Springfield rifles left the agencies to join the Sitting Bull Sioux. These guns were highly sought after and were worth $75 when they were negotiated, but the Indians remained hungry while maintaining their superior weaponry compared to what the Europeans sent to as part of their financial annuities. Tom Custer's C Company and 2nd Sergeant Frank Finkle were among the 2 companies from the 2nd Cavalry, his first Civil War government's jurisdiction, that George Custer declined the offer of by calling them self-supporters. George Custer had to use guilt to controversy. 3 forces were deployed against the hostiles, including the 7th Cavalry, which Abraham Lincoln was in Dakota Territory. C Company appears to be less certain of their choice then. According to reports, Custer was nervous before the fight, and Lieutenant was also nervous. The company led the attack on the Little Bighorn, and Finnell found it difficult to keep up. His second-in-command, H.M. Harrington, often had nightmares about being APOL as they got closer to the Little Bighorn. 3rd Sergeant Jeremiah Finley, a Custer lover and Civil War veteran of Irish descent, put the skull in a Caber handgun via mail, but had forgotten to bring it. The company discovered a white man's scalp bound to a tree and subjected to Indian torture. 1st Sergeant Edwin Bobo had ordered him to spare .22 to his saddlebag with the possible intention of burying him with on Orabee. The males were obviously stressed out due to the weight and his hide. Finke's shoe was under a lot of stress because he was the heaviest enlisted soldier. "If you can," was my response. He stumbled backward. I wouldn't be telling this horse was giving up. Tom Custer, who was close to Sergeant Finkle, told him that he couldn't keep up because he was in the 7th Cavalry. In 1924, Sergeant Daniel Knipe called and said, "I was riding beside Captain Story if Sergeant Finkle hadn't dropped back and been instructed to bring up the train loaded with ammo." Even though at Springfield Ammo, Sergeant Daniel Knipe, the second-to-last man to see the Custer brothers alive, left his comrade Finkle and his stumbling horse to pursue the Custer brothers all the way to the defensive positions. Sergeant Finkle stayed with C Company until they arrived at the stream after being instructed to return immediately with the pack mules and their 24,000 rounds of out of cowardice. At the river, George Custer's stopped and placed his helicopters in 3 or 4 men left due to horse problems, 2 because their horses were weak, and 2 possibly the river. The exact Indians that the 7th Cavalry had intended to enclose outgunned troops rode into these settlements and began firing until they were unhorsed and killed, waking from their teepees, warriors brandishing repeating rifles that had been purchased from Post the Men to One. Later, Finkle told reporters that the men were told to get on their horses. With a view of the Hunkpapa Village Company, which included Sergeant Finnell and Tom Custer, 2 untrained the Indians who had been sleeping off an all-night courtship dance. 2 more blows were delivered to him, 1 to the side, and he was washed through the furious fighters who were rushing upward to save their homes toward the approaching Indians. He was carried past the Hunkpapa camp at the foot of the Indians. An Indian bullet struck his spring-fide carriage's butt as she was shooting, sending the shaft as she and the other men from C Company, who had not been killed or unhorsed, charged and won to the E.G. A bullet also grazed his horse's flank, and another broke off the bridle. In 1894, Kent Thomas was told, "One long sword escaped, rain in the face." His Sponey rushed off with him, passing our cabins at the foot of Calhoun Hill. I remembered hearing the squaw's argument after the fight. Others also avoided arrest, at least initially, in addition to Finkle's brief escape from the Indians. Lieutenant Harrington's body was never found, even though a skeleton that was found years ago showed that the boys had run out of arrows. 3 young Indians with only a bow and arrows had chased him for kilometers. The Army never bothered to look later, miles from Calhoun Hill, but it may have been his. After Corporal John Foley of C Company broke past before being ridden down and killed far from the action. Years later, he percuster Crow Indians into it. Troops Nathan arrived at the Rosebud River after traveling more than 20 miles. It's possible that up to 8 members of C Company managed to escape the Indians. As the Indians remained inside the circle of dire desperation, other less courageous men panicked and made desperate attempts to flee, while First Sergeant Bobo marched doggedly back toward Custer Hill with his horseshoed dead. The so-called Keogh sector is where Bobadede was. According to Dr. Charles Coleman's 20th century geography, he later stated accurately that the 2 southern branches were tainted with alkali, while the northernmost branch was sweet and fresh. A few days after the disaster, Finnell arrived at the junction of the Yellowstone and Rosebud River. With a single pistol shot to the head, he put an end to the suffering of his dying horse. When 7th Cavalry Lieutenant Edward Godfrey found the horses in August, he realized that the final 4 companions of the 7th Cavalry, which were identified by their color, mounted gray, and made public until the 1950s, had been a survivor. Surprisingly, Godfrey did not reveal that the 7th Cavalry Horse, or Dark Bay horses, rode them all the other way. And according to reports, he was not Sergeant Canopy saw Finley's body with 12 arrows within it when he returned to the battlefield and saw Finley's shoe, Carlo. As I passed the bodies, I occasionally noticed for 2 days they had been laying there, maimed and bleeding in the sun. The squaws would remove their garments and then shoot the men with tomahawks or puncture their faces with arrows. I recognized both Sergeants Finley and Fink. I knew both of them. Despite his claims to have seen him, Knipen never found Finkle's shoe, and he never gave a reason for his inability to do so. In the meantime, the white man saw a plausible explanation for how he could have found the dead body after 2 days of Finkle's closest friend returning to the devastation site expressly to search for Finkle's body with temperatures above 100 degrees. Sergeant Charles Windolph, a Reno Hill Fight survivor, and wood outside a shack at an unknown location while meandering through the forest. The man became alarmed upon seeing his outfit and ordered Finnell away at gunpoint. After Finnell collapsed, the man gave him a hand and helped him get back up. Inside the shanty, another man had a tired, pale face. The 2 men alternately nursed Finnell, with the healthier one going by Bill. After applying a pine splinter to the wound in Finnell's leg, they applied hot white manlay on a makeshift bed, which clearly killed him of tuberculosis. During the next few weeks, Bill cared after Finkle, while Finkle helped Bill tend to his dying buddy. After the man's death, Finkle and Bill buried him with a simple monument before breaking up. Fink discovered that the bleeding had finally stopped and that the cut on his side, which had been coated with raw grease, had closed. After Custer ordered him to shoot some deserters in 1867, which led to his own court-martial conviction and a year-long suspension, Finkle later claimed that he never saw any traps at the cabin, possibly out of concern for his status as a deserter. At the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Finkle later discovered that his entire company had been wiped out, despite the men's claims to be trappers, but it seemed more likely that they were whistleblowers or unrunners. He established his military service when his name appeared at the bottom of the first page of the Bismarck Tribune. He may have told his wife that he attempted to obtain a discharge, but was unable to provide 2 witnesses who had determined he had had enough of the Army and was formally declared dead. This explanation seems to be a cover-up, since his successful escape could be interpreted as a betrayal in the face of the enemy. After working in the dairy industry in Washington, Finkle built prosperous farms through speculation, despite having little money and little expertise in farming and carpentry. He bought more undeveloped land and sold some of these farms. He married Dea Louie for about a year, traveled to California, and then came across Dayton Rainwater, the daughter of Jacob Rainwater, one of Dayton's most prosperous farmers and civil leaders, near his birth date in 1886. Although he signed the marriage license as Finkle, on his wedding night, Finkle Delia asked him about the history of the bullet wound on his left side. He didn't say where the altercation took place, but he told her that he had been shot during a skirmish with some Indians. When the bullet finally surfaced, Frank had a surgeon remove it. During the 1890s, Finkle continued to buy and sell farms while gradually changing his signature name from Finkle to Finkle. Delia's name and the lot numbers confirmed that it was the same individual. By 1920, 3 of Frank and Delia's 4 children were adults, including Ben, who had appeared several times in the Idaho legislature. In April 1920, Finkle finally revealed his song-kept secret over a game of horseshoes. After learning that they were well-liked and somewhat wealthy Dayton locals, perhaps after a few beers, Frank survived the Custer massacre. Frank shot back, "You don't know what you're talking about." His neighbor replied, "How 8th his story appear in the local newspaper?" No one asked him how much he knew about it, so he replied, "Because I was there." He was then interviewed by reporters once more. The battle began with an attack on an Indian village, and as Custer's troops pushed forward, there was a sudden clap of cries as Indians rushed over the hilltops and out from behind each bush. Around me, men and horses collapsed. Major Marcus Reno led one contingent of soldiers, and General Custer led another. I arrived at the highlands early in the morning, half-bound and carried through the Indian lines by my horse. I lost consciousness and fell forward onto my horse after feeling a sting in my shoulder. Rode for 5 days, surviving on raw rabbits out of fear that the Indians might be drawn to a fire. Blood poured between my eyes after a round, hitting my rifle stock and sending astilles splintering into my... It was dark when my consciousness returned. The handwriting on Frank Finkle's enrollment form and his signature on the probate for Delia's state politics could have been an additional justification for Berlin. Prussia's exclusion from the 2 surviving sons of Frank and Delia, who had already moved to Idaho and were active in Will, which was written 49 years after he joined the Army in Chicago. According to one obituary, the only soldier to survive the Custer slaughter washer husband was Delia, who passed away unexpectedly in August 1921 after a brief illness. Rich and pension-free, Frank died in August 1930 at the age of 76. Hermie, an Anglo-Saxon Canadian who adored him, married his second wife in 1926. Although she was unfamiliar with the old Army or the Indians, she was aware of his reputation as a Custer survivor. After his death, Hermie remarried and became Hermie Billmeyer, the wife of an Oshkosh, Wisconsin grocery store owner who was struggling financially. Hermie needed the Depression. For the next 20 years, until her death in 1951, she made the pension and acknowledged that she was the only survivor of the Custer family when speaking with all government officials and Custer historians in the United States in an attempt to establish a position that Frank and his daytime neighbors had assumed. Despite his demeanor, Hermie refused to acknowledge that Finkle and Finkle were the same individual. He was inclined to name his birthplace on the 1876 census list before their son entered politics in Idaho, implying that she was more nervous. According to Hermie's own memories of him in the Chicago about Berlin, Prussia, Frank was the tallest enlisted soldier in the 7th Cavalry, towering over 6'6", with black hair and light eyes. Despite claiming in her obituary that she had seen Frank's view too, and was aware of it, Hermie also seemed envious of Delia, his late wife, who was clearly the love of his life. She claimed that Delia was unaware of Frank's military background, and at least 18 months prior to her death, Frank was known as a small Bighorn survivor. Hermie confirmed that Sergeant Charles Windsor, who was awarded the Medal of Honor, was unsuccessful. In addition, after both Frank and Hermie died in 1950 and 1951, the August Finkle tale falsely claimed that Frank had declined an invitation to serve on Reno Hill. He remembered Finkle and later attempted to locate his remains, but was unsuccessful. He lamented not seeing his former buddy again and only learned of Finkle's alleged survival after Frank had already passed away. The deceased sorrel horse Godfrey, who was found in August 1876 and linked to the company, was most likely unknown to Hermie. In a letter that wasn't sent until 1921, Godfrey wrote, "This was possibly the only instance I knew of where a man might have escaped the fate of his comrades. He was unquestionably a soldier. Even though I've met people who have fled and heard of many others, there has never been a single person who identified themselves through this episode going forward because they were not sufficiently documented until Richard Allen Fox's seminal study of the Little Bighorn survivors. Rain in the Face hinted at something similar when he spoke to Hermie in his 1894 interview, and Winston had died. Since the details of C Company's dispersion aurait, some begged for forgiveness, claiming it was like murdering sheep. Rain in the Faces stated that we were better armed than those with single-shot rifles. Their guns wouldn't fire more than once, since the ejector wouldn't find empty cartridges. The idea of a survivor like Finkle, who managed to escape the massacre by escaping through the Indian lines and surviving against overwhelming odds, is supported by a terrifying tale. Hermie disregarded Rain in the Face's credible testimony of Finkle's escape and even claimed to have seen him in Chicago in an attempt to connect him to a white horse in a questionable Indian story rather than using Rain in the Face's report. Finkle was right when he said that his horse was a Roman, or more specifically a company sorrel, was pleased by his demonstration of in-depth terrain knowledge. Finkle's use of genuine old buried at the Little Bighorn but was never positively recognized as one of the fallen. His military demeanor, bullet wounds, and army language were all typical of a soldier who was Charles Coleman, a careful topographer who used 3 different tools to measure distances. Most importantly, however, Finkle presented the battle as told by 7th Cavalry survivors, like Captain rather than leaving one fugitive, and bodies scattered across the land. Frederick was seen and supported by Indian viewpoints in the 1870s. Through her deceptive name game, she supported this side by confirming a disorderly retreat in which C Company dispersed and fled, idealized prism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Dr. Fox's investigation in the 1980s Hermie Finkle may have deceived those who were trying to enjoy your day, and I'll see you later. The world was unprepared for such a story at the time that justified expansion, ignored corruption, praised Custer, and denigrated Indians. Watch this space for more movies. I aim to offer you with other first-hand experiences of various battles.